Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Ahead of the Curve, What Publishers Can Learn from Other Industries Regarding Royalties and Payments. I'm Brian O'Leary, Executive Director of the Book Industry Study Group. In thinking through this particular session, a number of us, both in the Rights Committee and within BISG as a whole, talked about how the sales of things like audiobooks, subscription products, and other digital offerings have continued to increase both as a share and in absolute numbers across most segments of the publishing industry. In some cases, we found, and we've heard from publishers and content providers who were not prepared for this change in sales patterns, specifically regarding their ability to support royalties payments. So we put together this webinar, which includes experts from Metacomment, Exactuals, and Concurrent Media Strategies, to talk about what publishers might be able to learn from other industries that have dealt with similar changes and improve and accelerate how they handle royalty payments. Today's session actually has 5 different topics, and we're going to have a conversation around each of them. The first of these is the operational efficiencies that have already been obtained by other industries, so essentially good benchmark examples. We're going to talk about how digital tools have been developed within one vertical and can be adapted for others. We'll then move on to alternative deal structures that allow flexibility in negotiations, but you have to be able to track them, and having the systems to support that is important. There are certain trends that are going to continue to, if not are already affecting how publishing works. And then we'll have a short go round on what to avoid, lessons learned from other parts of the industry. Today's panelists, actually, we're fortunate to have 3, as I said, experts in this area. The first of whom is Lindsay Conlon. Lindsay, you can raise your hand. Who's Director of Business Development at Exactuals, which works to modernize the way the entertainment industry makes payments, including paying residuals, royalties, marketplace payments, and similarly complex transactions. In her role, she focuses on building partnerships, negotiating deals, developing marketing strategies, and more. So it keeps her busy. Our second panelist is David Marlin, who co-founded Metacomment Systems in 2000. It's hard to imagine it's already 21. Beyond his expertise in the world of royalty automation, David's committed to enhancing the technological capabilities of the publishing world. He's the founding co-chair of the Book Industry Study Group's Digital Sales Reporting Committee, and he was a former co-chair of our Rights Committee. Last, not least, Paul Sweeting is the founder and principal at Concurrent Media Strategies, which is a Washington, D.C. based consulting company that specializes in media, technology, and public policy issues. He's also co-founder of the Rights Tech Project, a business community focused on technology innovation and the management and licensing of media rights, so clearly focused on today's topic. Prior to launching Concurrent Media, Paul was a business journalist and an analyst, writing for Billboard, Variety, Publishers Weekly, GigaOM. Remember GigaOM? And other leading media and technology publications. So we're fortunate to have all 3 of you today. And I'd like to then turn to our first question, which is really, what are the operational efficiencies already obtained by other industries? What examples can we use? And I'm going to turn off the screen sharing so that people can see you a little bit better, and turn it over to Paul to ask you, what can we learn from other businesses? Paul, I just want to remind you to unmute yourself as you get started.
Sorry about that. Thanks, Brian, for inviting me to be on this panel. I'm thrilled to be here with David and Lindsay. Operational efficiencies in other industries. A lot of it has been focused, a lot of the efforts in that area have been focused around metadata standards and technical standards for managing the greatly increased volume of data that publishers of all types have to cope with these days because of the shift in how entertainment and media content is used and consumed, and the enormous number of small value transactions that have resulted from those changes. So obviously standards are not a new topic necessarily. The publishing industry has ISBN standard, it has Onyx, but what it doesn't have at this point, and something that in my view it's increasingly going to need, is a works level unique identifier. That is an identifier of works that is independent of any format or configuration in which that work is embodied. And the reason for that is that as has happened in parallel industries or adjacent industries, the number of formats and configurations in which works are being embodied and the number of use cases that they are supporting has grown enormously. And if you keep issuing product-based IDs for each one of those iterations of formats and configurations, that's a recipe for complexity and an invitation to potential conflicts, ambiguity, and confusion. And so the way other industries have looked to tackle that is to create works level unique IDs that is mappable to product-based IDs. If you look at the music industry, for instance, that's a pretty good example of what not to do. In this area, they've had a terrible time since the ascendancy of streaming has overtaken that business in making sure, identifying the works being used and associating that use with the people who should be getting paid for that use of that work. And there are a lot of reasons for that. They do have works level, and they've for a long time had works level IDs. But they've been very inconsistently applied. And they're for every musical recording, there are actually two copyrights. There's a copyright on the recording and a copyright on the underlying work, and they're managed and administered separately. And they've had a devil of a time trying to map the sound recording, what in copyright law is called the sound recording ID, called the ISRC, the International Standard Recording Code, to the underlying composition, the song, which is called the ISWC, the International Standard Works Code. And as a result, there's a huge problem of unpaid royalties in the music industry. Royalties get collected and nobody knows or can identify who that money is supposed to go to. So it sits in a what the industry calls a black box, and it sometimes just sort of disappears. And so it's they've had a terrible time because they had not prepared in advance for what streaming was going to do and the need it was going to create for a consistent, efficient, widely adopted works level identifier. Now, to be fair, it's a little bit more complicated in the music industry because, first of all, you have the two copyrights, separately administered copyrights. You also have collective management and collective licensing of some of those some of the rights in the music industry, which the publishing industry really doesn't have. And that has been a source of the problem. You have these large collective management organizations who are collecting the royalties from radio stations, from venues, from from restaurants, from bars, from wherever music is being used, publicly used, and then it needs to, they scoop up all of this money, and then they're supposed to pay it back out to the appropriate parties. But if they cannot identify the appropriate parties, that doesn't happen, or at least it doesn't happen consistently and efficiently. And it's also complicated because it's a highly regulated industry, unlike the publishing industry. The music industry is, the collective licensing system is largely a regulatory system imposed by governments around the world. So that would not obtain in the publishing industry. But a better model, I think, to look at would be the EIDR system in the audiovisual world. That's the Entertainment Identifier Registry, EIDR. And it was established within the audiovisual industries, the film, the television, the video, television advertising business, to create a works level identifier for audiovisual assets. And it was an industry-wide effort. The system is now administered by a industry nonprofit, overseen primarily by an organization called Movie Labs, which is a consortium of the Hollywood studios and other production entities, and Cable Labs, which is a consortium of, well, it started in the cable industry, but it has sort of expanded beyond that, as well as Comcast and Rovi, which is a company that it's a metadata company in that business. And it's an open standard. Anyone can register. It's free for the companies to, it's free to register a work with EIDR. It's an extensible, what's known as an extensible standard. That is, as new requirements for identifying works in new contexts arise, it can be added onto, the EIDR system can be added onto, and importantly, it's mappable to any other metadata standard within those industries. So the works level identifier can be mapped to rights metadata or other types of metadata standards that are used within those industries, and that's really key. That level of interoperability is really key, and of course it includes a taxonomy for describing the assets and describing their relationship to other assets and to other entities, and that is used, or that's part of what is used, that taxonomy, to generate the unique IDs. So it sort of ties together, the standard sort of ties together an identifier and a taxonomy. So that might be a model worth looking at for the publishing industry. The other critical element in data standards are technical standards, referring to the means by which rights information, metadata, other types of information are communicated between domains, because works, IP assets are increasingly crossing into a lot of different domains. If you look at what's happened in the music industry, for instance, apart from Spotify and Amazon Music and radio and the things we're all familiar with, the fitness industry, for instance, has become a huge user of music. Peloton is one of the biggest licensees for the record labels and the publishers right now, because they incorporate music into their own subscription fitness class service. Music has become, the video game industry is another big user of music. So there is a standard, a technical standard, it's called DDEX, Digital Data Exchange, which is really a collection of standards for how to communicate, music relevant data among different domains that music may touch, and it's maintained again by a nonprofit association known as DDEX, and So that's another key piece of creating efficiencies is developing standards for communicating data among different domains.
Lindsay, maybe you could talk a little bit about how payments are handled, because that's a core area that the Exactuals is involved with.
Yeah, absolutely. And Paul makes all great points. You know, when we're talking payments with our music customers in particular, metadata is a big part of that conversation. And oftentimes we say, if you don't have good metadata in place, you're not going to be able to make payments or collect on all the royalties that you are due. So that is a big part of being in a position to be able to make efficient and accurate payments, is definitely sorting out the metadata. But some of the other operational efficiencies that we have seen, really starting in film and television, then kind of moving more into music as kind of a trend for each of these things. Definitely the big one is moving away from paper checks and adopting electronic payment methods such as direct deposit, international direct deposit when possible. So that's been a very, very big trend. Not only is it, does it remove the need to sign every single paper check, it also can be more expensive to send a paper check than the royalty amounts that were actually being paid, or the residual amounts that were being paid. So there's an economic benefit as well. And then we were recently just doing a study internally on how much paper is being saved. And of course, during the times that we're all living in today, being able to execute those kind of payments from a computer or anywhere in the world is a really valuable efficiency to be able to leverage. A couple of the other efficiencies that we've seen as big bonuses for our clients definitely has to do with the payee registration process as well. So typically, every company will kind of have a different way of collecting payee information. So let's say you have an author that maybe you just signed, and perhaps you are asking them what their preferred payment method is. You're asking for a lot of personally identifiable information when you're saying how do I pay you, right? So super sensitive information, of course. People have probably heard about some of the data leaks that have happened in other parts of the entertainment industry when it comes to some of this sensitive information. And so a lot of companies today are adopting very secure systems that are able to replace that sort of manual payee registration process. And that's something that we're able to offer within our payments platform. But what it really does is it puts the burden of keeping the payee information up to date on the payee themselves. So they can go ahead and take ownership of that information. They're highly incentivized to do so. Of course, they want to be paid. They want to know that it's secure, but they can go in, select their payment methods, update them at any point in time, and a third party can store that sensitive information. They can validate that information. You know, we do all of the identity verification and things like that. So payee registration is definitely one area of efficiency that may not be, you may not even realize that's a problem that you have internally. Is the conversation that we have a lot of times is, oh, I didn't realize there was a better, more efficient way to do these sorts of things. And really just all of the automation that can come along with using a software-based payment method to automate statement delivery, to automate kind of bulk or batch payments, the approval of those payments. And really what you end up with is then a centralized sort of repository of all of the payments that you've ever made. Your payees are able to see that. And hopefully what we've heard is a lot of our clients get a lot less phone calls of saying, hey, could you send me that royalty statement from 2 years ago? I'm being audited. I need to get access to that. They can just find all of that information themselves.
So David, go ahead, Paul.
Just to pick up on one thing that Lindsay said, which is, I think, very important, is having a system, an open system where people who are due payments can update, look at and update their own information. In the music industry, for instance, I mentioned the difficulty in mapping recording IDs to works IDs, and attaching that to or associating that with rights metadata, who actually owns the rights to this. An act of Congress passed a couple of years ago called the Music Modernization Act, established a new collective management organization called the Mechanical Licensing Collective. I won't go into the whole history of mechanical rights. It's a weird little wrinkle in the music industry, but part of what the MLC was tasked by Congress to do was to create a centralized registry that connected recording data to works data, and to have a open system where rights owners, creators, and others can go in and correct bad information that had that companies and organizations may have had on them, bad addresses, bad different spellings. There was a study I saw just recently. Somebody came up with, I think it was like 11 different spellings of Beyonce. Some of them had Beyonce Knowles, some of them just Beyonce, and to be able to reconcile all of that conflicting data is very important. So it's important to have that sort of open architecture where people can update data on themselves.
In a related way, David, I was going to ask you about auditability and interoperability. I mean, these are core topics to the way you think about rights and royalties communications. David,
Yeah.
I'm just going to remind you to unmute yourself.
Thank you, Brian. Yeah, and,
Okay.
and thank you for having us. Really appreciate being here. Yes, so auditability is something that we see quite a bit in a lot of other industries, and less so in publishing, but we are seeing an increase in auditing in publishing. And so I think this is one area that publishers may want to become more efficient at. And there's oftentimes a lot of fear with going through an audit. And so really the solution to that fear is to make the process extremely simple. And there's really a couple different kinds of audits that people can go through. There's, especially as we see publishers license more content from larger licensors like the Disneys and the Universals of the world. Those organizations frequently audit their licensees, and so the ability to be able to easily and quickly and reliably generate an audit reports that you can provide to the auditors is something that we're seeing outside of publishing that I think is going to be moving more and more into publishing. And similar to that are internal audits. A lot of one of the biggest pain points we hear with royalties is the uncertainty and the fear of making mistakes. And by doing, and so a lot of these non-publishers are doing a lot more internal audits so that they know that everything's right when they do get the expected external audits. But it has this side benefit of giving you total confidence that everything is coming out correctly. So everything, I think one area where publishers can learn from other media is definitely making this auditing process as efficient as possible. And there's really, what we found in other industries, and even in publishing, because many publishers do get audited, I would say quite a bit less than other industries, is there's really 3 reports that can seem to provide auditors with what they need. And it's really a report of every sales transaction and the corresponding royalty was calculated, every non-sales adjustment that goes in, things like advances and fees, and then a roll-up report, which rolls all those together at the work level and author level, or royalty recipient level. And then those 3 reports can pretty quickly and easily tie out to the various royalty statements and payments. And then in terms of the interoperability piece, this is actually an area where I think publishing is doing a much better job than it was a couple of years ago. We're seeing a lot more intelligent system integrations. We're a certified NetSuite partner. We see a lot of companies doing integrations with NetSuite, with Dynamics, with various publishing platforms out there. you know, and doing it intelligently too, because you don't want to necessarily have an automated accrual or payment integration if you're only paying out royalties once a year. The overhead in creating that automation is or twice a year. It's the overhead and maintenance is not necessarily worth it. So I think publishers are actually doing a good job when it comes to this, a much better job than they were just a couple of years ago when it comes to this interoperability piece.
David, when I was just going to add, oftentimes when you and I talk about interoperability, there's this question of, well, oftentimes we hear people want API access. And then you and I have had the conversation where, the old-fashioned way of just exporting and importing can be the most efficient way. I was just curious if you'd touch on that a little bit.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And we work with again, we work with a lot of like really large ERP system vendors, and a lot of times, surprisingly, that's their preferred way of integrating is exporting and importing CSV files. It leaves it leaves a remnant or an artifact that can then be used to help with auditing, going back to the auditing purpose. And it's so much less overhead than maintaining these APIs. So yeah, that's a really good point, Lindsay. We see that a lot, and a lot of companies are they don't like the idea of a CSV export and import. Let's just build an API, but there's so much overhead in maintaining those APIs between different systems that the CSV integration is often the best way to go. You're absolutely right.
Awesome, thank you.
And Lindsay, I was going to ask you about payment platforms before we move on to talk about deal structures. The book publishing business looked at, on the supply chain side, implementing a payment platform with a UK subsidiary, Batch, a couple of years ago, and ran into a number of problems. So I'm curious what other industries have encountered in terms of implementing payment platforms that kind of streamline that service.
What other industries are doing? Yeah, I think some of the things that I ask to kind of understand the payment landscape for a particular business has to do with payment frequency, probably first and foremost. The more frequently you are making payments, the more complex it becomes, right? And there's definitely, in music at least, this desire on the artist side to be paid more frequently than twice a year, let's say, or once a year in some cases. There's definitely more of a push toward monthly payments, even advances on royalties. So the more frequently that you're making payments, the more complexity there is. And then also the number of payees that you have, of course, adds a lot of complexity as well, right? Keeping all of that data up to date and whatnot, especially in other industries. I don't know if it's as common in the book publishing space, but in the music side of things, we're making global payments, to all sorts of different countries. And I think it's really important when you are looking at a payment provider that they do have really solid currency coverage. They're able to make payments to those territories securely, that a paper check might get lost in its replace. And also wires oftentimes used to be the only option for making those sort of payments, but they're incredibly expensive. So those are some of the questions that I'll use to kind of gauge the complexity of the payment landscape, what certain client is dealing with. And then also a lot of times there are multiple business units that operate on different payment schedules within a music company, for example. A lot of music companies today will have a record label and a publishing company, and they might be a management company as well, or offering label services. You're seeing a lot more overlap between the services that these companies are offering, and that adds a lot of complexity to the process. I don't know if that answers your question, Paul.
It does. No, that's really helpful. And I think it also sets us up for a conversation about what alternative deal structures might look like. If I bring it back to Paul, how do you think about things like working with partners or managing at the level of a brand? You started talking a little bit about that in your first set of remarks, but how does it play with respect to deal structures?
Well, I think the trend is going to be toward deal structures that are less format specific, because as I mentioned in the previous segment, intellectual property assets, music, literary properties, videos, increasingly are crossing the species line, as I like to say. They can appear in, music, isn't just in music channels anymore. It's in fitness, it's in games, it's in, it's everywhere. Same with video. People are incorporating video into other assets, when you're working with a partner, when you're licensing your rights to a partner for exploitation, it may be that partner is in a position to do more things with the content that will generate revenue for you, for the rights owner, than than the specific use you may have in mind in licensing it. And you have to think about whether is it more efficient to have multiple partners doing the overhead of doing all of those deals, and the complexity of dealing with so many different licensors and vendors, or whether it might be more efficient to deal with a single partner doing multiple things, even if the total revenue may be lower, your net from it may be higher if you eliminate some of the transaction costs involved in format specific deals. So it's I don't have a clear-cut recommendation on it, but I do think that deal structures are probably going to get less format specific. And that is a whole mindset change. I mean, it's typically rights owners like to be very, very specific about what use they're licensing for, and but it's getting harder to define those uses narrowly because of the sort of generative quality of digital platforms and the number of use cases that they can spawn. It's getting harder to contractually define uses, and so deal structures are likely going to have to become somewhat more flexible.
And Lindsay, there's also a shift to things like artists retaining ownership, and then labels responding differently to providing them services. How does that work?
Absolutely. There has been so much activity over the last few years of catalogs being sold for insane multiples, right? On the publishing side and on the recording side as well. And I think a trend generally that we've seen on the music side of things is artists want to naturally retain more of their copyright. And at the same time, a lot of technology has come into the music space. A lot of startups who are able to focus on these services a label is able to typically provide. And when it comes to marketing the content, they're able, so as those platforms are kind of coming into existence and artists are wanting to retain their ownership, there's definitely a change in what a label is providing or able to provide to an artist today. We'll even see when it comes to distribution, there are also so many ways to distribute your content as a music creator today, that really you may be able to operate independently much easier than you ever have been able to before. And even distributors we see are offering marketing solutions to their, artists as a way to differentiate themselves from other distributors. So kind of, I don't want to say gone are the days of needing a record label to market yourself and to distribute yourself effectively, but that is certainly a trend that we've seen in music and has allowed for artists to retain their ownership. So I think we'll continue to see that. I think we'll continue to see independent releases and a lot more sort of a la carte engagements between an artist and a label, or more specifically, maybe even a marketing agency.
Thanks.
Yeah,
And
that's already happening in the music industry. I mean, the labels have been forced to sort of unbundle the services that they provide to an artist. So, a label deal is no longer an all in one sort of deal that it historically has been, and that's something that could well happen in the publishing business as well. That it will be your publishing your deal with your publisher may become more of an a la carte affair, because there will be other means of getting your product to market, marketing it, promoting it, and to exploiting it. So that's another sort of alternative deal structure that that could emerge.
I think the last piece of this, David, is things like minimum guarantees, which is probably more common outside of publishing than it is in book publishing.
Yeah, I would say minimum guarantees are almost standard outside of book in a lot of a lot of other media industries, and much less so. We do see them, but it's it's actually quite rare in publishing to have minimum guarantees. But as we're starting to see and work with more customers that are licensing from these big corporations, licensing characters and name and likeness, and they're insisting on minimum guarantees. So I think, and publishers are doing more of that licensing. So I think minimum guarantees are something that I think publishing is going to start to see more of. And for those of you who don't know, it's basically for a given royalty period, or sometimes it's for an entire year, you guarantee the licensor a certain royalty. And if you're below that, you have to adjust to make up for that difference. And then another, just to kind of reiterate on what Paul was saying earlier, is especially, we see, I think the industry is seeing a bit of a trend towards a lot more risk sharing between publishers and authors in the form of, so-called hybrid publishers. And in those situations, these single term royalties where you basically just pay one rate, doesn't matter where the sale is, those are becoming much more common in publishing. It happens all the time outside of publishing, where you just pay one royalty rate for everything. And we're starting to see more of that in publishing. One great advantage that publishers have, though, over a lot of other industries is because they're used to paying these crazy royalty rules. I mean, publishing has some of the craziest royalty rules of any industry. They have that flexibility to make these more complex deal structures when they need to, because they're just kind of they're set up for it. But I think in terms of the trends, I think it's probably moving a little bit more towards simplicity in that regard.
Maybe if I keep you on this, we'll talk a little bit about trends that might affect publishing. David, you've thought a lot about this from your perspective with offering a service in terms of royalties, but reporting expectations are changing. I mean, in what ways and how does it affect book publishing?
Yeah, they are definitely changing. We're seeing a lot more, especially in these more hybrid models, but we're seeing a lot. So other industries, like, when you report royalties to one of those big media conglomerates, they're going to insist on seeing a lot of times transactional level detail. They want to see every single transaction that went through your system. And more often, although I would say most often not, but more often we're starting to see a higher frequency of that need in book publishing, where publishers, especially in the more hybrid models, the risk sharing models, where authors and royalty recipients are wanting to see the transaction level details. It creates problems, these transaction level details, because there's a lot of valid information in those transaction details that royalty recipients just don't get. Like sometimes destroyed product or damaged product will show up as a $0 sale with multiple units. And an author might call up and say, how come I didn't get any royalties on this? Or review copies get sent out. So sharing those transactional details can have very, I think, legitimate downsides. But we are, and so I think you do have to be careful about that. But you know, it is, we are seeing more of it. So it might be coming more into publishing, where you've got to provide those transactional level details in a very simple way, like through an online portal or in a separate report. And related to that is a lot of these larger media companies are requiring royalties to be reported in a very specific way. So, you know, if you're working with Disney, for instance, you've got to report your royalties in their format. If you're working with, you know, Universal, you got to report it in their format, a very specific format. And so we're starting to see more of this. It happens all the time outside of publishing, but we're starting to see more of it in publishing, where royalties are being required to be reported in a very specific, usually data-oriented way. And so that's important. Another trend we're seeing in publishing, and I think Paul will talk a little bit in more detail about this, but is bundling, where you're seeing chunks of content, for lack of a better word, being grouped together and sold as a package. I mean, sometimes it's physical bundling, like in a kit where you're, you know, selling to Walmart a kit of books. But it's also, we're seeing with the proliferation of digital content, we're seeing a lot more bundling of content, where you know, maybe someone will pay for, you know, 30 different chunks of content from different sources. And so then all of that, the revenue from that bundle has to be, we call it exploded or allocated out into the individual components so that royalties can get paid out. And that's one area where actually a work level identifier could be useful, because so many of these bundled components, it doesn't really make sense to, you know, I don't necessarily have the expertise to speak on this, but it doesn't always seem to make sense to have an ISBN associated with a chapter of content. So you might have your own internal identifiers, but ultimately you need to roll them up to a work level identifier so that you know what work you need to pay royalties out on.
Thanks, David.
Yeah, just to pick up on that, it's, you know, in other industries are going through, you know, similar challenges around reporting of usage and trying to standardize. I mean, in the music industry, you know, a publisher, a music publisher may be dealing with, you know, 30 or 40 collective management organizations around the world, and each of them have their own reporting standards for how they report royalties. And there's definitely a move toward trying to simplify that, because the volume of transactions is just so much higher. And in the film industry, well, the sort of intersection of the film and television and music industries, there's something called cue sheets, which are reports on, you know, the usage of music in an audiovisual work, in a larger audiovisual work. So, you know, a song or a bit of a song that appears in a television commercial or appears in a movie or on television. There have been all sorts of different ways that people report those so-called cue sheets. But with, again, the volume of uses and transactions exploding, there is a move toward trying to standardize that sort of standardized cue sheet reporting. So, you know, I think David's point about trying to simplify, you know, how usage data is reported is a key point.
Lindsay, from your perspective, you know, a lot of things that are happening that might migrate into book publishing include things like payments, move online. It sounds like that statements are more regularly available without having to wait for a piece of paper. And you talked about frequency. Are those kinds of things that book publishing should be mindful of?
I think so, absolutely. I think it's challenging when you're also facing this explosion of data, to Paul's point and David's point as well, to report on, crunch all those numbers faster and pay faster and be transparent about the whole thing. It can certainly be an overwhelming thing to digest, right? But those are the trends. That's what creators are demanding. It is how companies, at least in music, are staying competitive. You know, for a record label who knows that they can be replaced by a la carte marketing services, may be more appealing to an artist if they are able to report in a timely manner, pay in a variety of different methods efficiently, and also provide a level of transparency that artists haven't been privy to in the past. And I imagine those same things can apply to really any creator-centric industry. And then I think too, the other thing that creators are really expecting today, or almost assume is the status quo, is portal access, somewhere they can log in on their cell phone to see this information in as close to real time as possible. So I know that's a very big shift from maybe receiving a paper check and a paper statement in the mail a couple times a year, but that is what creators are almost taking as the status quo, and will become a really competitive differentiator, like it has in film and television and music specifically.
I want to leave a little bit of time for questions, but maybe each of you could throw in on things that you would recommend that book publishing as an industry at least avoid. I mean, what kinds of problem areas have other industries encountered that, or at least a warning sign or a benchmark to not follow?
Avoid collective management and and regulation at all costs.
What is from, maybe explain collective management, because if you're not familiar with the music business.
In the music industry, and if you are a restaurant or a bar or you know, a venue where people gather and you play music in the background, that's a public performance of those works, and you know, rather than for that venue to individually license every work that gets played, particularly in the case of, you know, if they're playing a stream or a radio station where they don't control what's being played, it's almost impossible it is impossible for them to you know, effectively license each of those uses individually. And so those licenses those rights are licensed as you know, in a blanket license through organizations such as ASCAP, BMI, CSAC. Those are the main ones in the US, SOCAN in Canada. But in every country, those organizations exist. And what you get for that license is a blanket license to use, you know, it's almost like insurance. You know, you get a blanket license to use any work in their repertoire, which is millions of tracks in each case. And so if you're a venue and you have you know, in the US, and you've got CSAC, your CSAC license, your BMI license, and your ASCAP license, you're pretty much covered. There are a few smaller ones that have come along, like GRP. So that, you know, but it's a form of blanket licensing to reduce the transaction costs and the transaction complexity. And their rights owners, I mean, it's an effective way of dealing with that problem, but it tends to kind of mush everything together. And so there's a constant tension in those industries between, you know, collective management of individual rights. And it's just a layer of complexity. And in the US, ASCAP and BMI have, at least since the early 1940s, have operated under consent decrees with the Justice Department to settle antitrust suits that were brought back and around the time of the Second World War, or coming out of the Second World War. So, it just adds a layer of complexity to the industry, and the music industry has been fighting for years to get out from under the consent decrees and other sorts of compulsory licensing, statutory licensing, which the music industry is riddled with. And I mean, there have been some movements in the publishing industry recently. The state of Maryland has tried to introduce a form of compulsory licensing for ebooks and audiobooks in public libraries.
Particularly popular piece of legislation in book publishing.
Yeah. So it is a danger to look out for. Movements toward compulsory statutory licensing. I haven't followed that case that closely, so I don't know what the actual current status of that law is in Maryland. But
we're going to save that one for another day.
That'll probably be in
Lindsay,
whole other discussion.
Lindsay, from your perspective, something to avoid?
Something to avoid? Yeah, paper, wherever you can replace paper with digital, I think is a no-brainer, not an easy transition, but I think you'll be happier for it, and so will your payees. And then really wherever internally there is an opportunity for a human error to be made when it comes to metadata, when it comes to royalty administration and payments, I think those would be the first places to look for automation and technology solutions that are, specifically designed to make that as foolproof as possible and allow you to have some of your time back to focus on more useful things. So those would be my tips on what to avoid.
And David, how about from your perspective? What have you learned? What do you think lessons that other industries could bring in for things to avoid?
I'm going to go back to the auditing. I think that publishers should avoiding auditing themselves. A lot of them, in my experience, a lot of publishers just assume that their royalties are okay, and it creates anxiety. And once you get into the habit of auditing yourself, and it becomes easy, straightforward, it gives you confidence that everything's coming out correctly. So I think sort of avoiding, tracking your own internal accuracy is something to avoid. I think in this day of transparency, it's important to be able to prove to yourself that everything's coming out correctly, so that you have confidence to prove to others when the need arises.
I had one thing that I think the publishing industry will not be able to avoid, and that is subscriptions. I know that it is a very unpopular topic in the industry, but every other copyright-based industry has moved to an access-based model, monetized by subscription. The music industry is already there. Film and television industry is going there. I just saw some data on the games industry that 52% of regular gamers now subscribe to an all-you-can-eat service. And there just isn't any reason to that I can see that it won't happen in the publishing industry. And in fact, it's already happening outside of the U.S. Storytel, keeps expanding outside of the U.S. Audible has been adding all you can eat. It just added India. That's a lot of books. There are a lot of ebooks and audiobooks. And just a week or so ago, Spotify acquired Findaway, and Spotify's model is all you can eat subscription. So I just don't see any way that the publishing industry is not going to have to figure out how to deal in a subscription access-based model.
We have time for a couple of questions, and I wanted to start with one from Chris Kleeman, who is chair of our rights committee. And she made the observation a few minutes ago in listening to the three of you speak, that a lot of what that she was hearing would require a mind shift in publishing with respect to rights. And she's kind of curious from your perspective, what would you advise us to do? What step would publishing take first and perhaps benefit the most? I mean, how do we get started implementing these kinds of things in book publishing?
Well, I think there's sort of two levels to that question. One is at the sort of industry level, and one is at the individual publisher level. And at the individual publisher level, I think the big mindset sea change is going to be thinking about your business as managing a portfolio of IP assets, rather than focusing on the sort of near-term P&L of individual assets. The business you're going to be in, and the music industry has now gone through that, and it was wrenching, but it's actually been beneficial for them to, you see, Lindsay referred to this earlier, that music rights, particularly publishing rights, but also recording rights, have become an attractive asset class for financial investors. And that's true because the music publishers and the record labels have increasingly taken a portfolio management approach to their business, and it's led to higher valuations. So from a shareholder value perspective, that's actually a model that has a lot of value for rights owners. And then at the so that's at the industry level, get to work on, start establishing the consortia that are going to create the sort of standards, data standards, that the industry is increasingly going to need.
Yeah, I think we audition for that pretty regularly. David or Lindsay, how about from your perspective, what would be a good first step, or maybe a good early step to take for if you're a book publisher or engaged in the publishing business? David's debating.
I mean, I've wanted to see this. I chaired the rights committee years ago. I know Chris chairs it now, and they're working on this. I think having a taxonomy of terminology would be helpful, because there's so many formats that are proliferating. I mean, just various types of digital, and sometimes you see contract terms, and you're like, well, does this type of format of sale fall under this contract term or this contract term? And if we kind of had taxonomies agreed to, that could, I think, alleviate some of that. It's an ongoing battle, but I would love to see the industry pick up some more standardization in terminology.
And then, how about you? I mean, you've got a good breadth of experience with companies that don't think like we do. How do we change to be able to embrace these coming business models?
I would say outsourcing where it makes economic sense, right? So you can really maintain the core competency on the creative side and not get weighed down by this massive volume of data that is going to continue to exponentially grow, and the needs of the creators and other rights holders whose needs are going to change and evolve, if it's possible to outsource those particular pain points that are covered by other technologies, and really just be able to hone in on that core competency you started with in the first place, I think.
And I think the one clear takeaway for me is the primacy of a work level identifier, which, as everybody on this panel knows, within book publishing has not succeeded. We had the ISTC and a couple of different attempts at implementing the ISTC, which was the International Standard Text Code for book publishing. And it just, it's really been folded by the ISO at this point. But that we still operate with the product specific identifier, the ISBN, which is a essentially the work in a format as our primary, and you're making the clear argument, I think, particularly Paul, that that's not going to hold up long term as we go to different business models and more aggregated brand level implementation of a rights and royalties scheme. On that sobering note, it gives us work to do. I want to thank you, Paul, David, Lindsay, for your time today, for having put so much thought into what other industries have learned as both business models and consumer expectations have changed. And it's going to probably spin out into a lot of other conversations and perhaps a few more webinars in 2022 as well. Thanks again for the time today, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you,
Thanks so much.
Brian. Thank you,
Appreciate
everybody.
it.
Yep, take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.